Welcome. I'm Sita Pai, and I head up Children's Media and Education at GBH. We're so glad you can join us today for a conversation about the power of using American experience films to teach difficult history in the classroom. A special thank you to all you educators. You are our inspiration and our reason for being. And to GBH and PBS, friends and family, thanks for your support. I'm delighted to introduce two of my simply fantastic colleagues. We're thrilled to have Cameo George here with us. Cameo is the executive producer of American Experience at GBH. She is an Emmy Award-winning producer, writer, and journalist with more than 20 years of experience in documentary, broadcast television, and digital content production. Cameo has produced, developed, and commissioned innovative programming at CNN, NBC News, and ABC News. She was the senior producer of CNN's groundbreaking series Black in America and Latino in America, and the executive producer of the 8-hour PBS documentary series 16 for 16, The Contenders, which was also broadcast on the BBC. Most recently, Cameo was at ABC News, where she was head of development for long-form projects, responsible for creating a pipeline of docuseries and feature documentaries across Walt Disney television platforms, including ABC News, Hulu, National Geographic, and Disney+. Cameo joined American Experience in 2020 and has led production for a slate of powerful films for public media's leading history series, some of which you're going to learn about today. And we're so grateful to have Alysha here with us in person from DC. Alysha Butler is a 23-year veteran social studies teacher. Yes, she's 23 years old too. She currently teaches AP African American Studies and U.S. History for the District of Columbia Public Schools and serves as a senior manager for inclusive social studies curriculum at GBH, where she works as a curriculum developer for the online PBS LearningMedia U.S. History and Civics Collections and American Experience. She was recognized as the 2019 History Teacher of the Year by the Daughters of the American Revolution for the District of Columbia and the 2019 Gilda Lehrman National History Teacher of the Year for her innovative lessons and civic-based student projects. In 2020, she was appointed as the first teacher to ever serve on the Gilda Lehrman Board of Trustees. She most recently served as a contributing author to the updated third edition of Freedom on My Mind, a history of African Americans with documents for the AP course, and worked as a contributor on the 2022 and 2024 College Board Development Committee for the new AP African American Studies course. Thank you both so much for leading us in this very important conversation. Alysha, over to you.
Thank you, Sita. So, Cameo, you came to American Experience in 2020. What drew you to the series?
I was not necessarily looking to change when the opportunity was first presented to me, but as soon as it was presented to me, I was like, I'm going for this. Like this is an incredible series with an incredible legacy. I think at the point when I joined, it was maybe there were 33 seasons, so there was this incredible catalog of well-researched, entertaining, enlightening history documentary series. And as a person who has worked for the majority of my career in documentary, I just thought, why wouldn't I want to be a part of this? And so that's one side. That's the professional side. On the personal side, you will remember the spring and summer of 2020 was one of extreme turmoil in our country. People were in the streets protesting. We were also trapped at home with a pandemic, and it just felt like everything was upside down, and we were just grappling with what do we do with our country and democracy. And I just thought, what better vehicle to try to impart lessons of civics and democracy and people power and all of those things than an illustrious, innovative series like American Experience.
Yeah.
So it was really twofold. Like the personal side was just like, of course, like this is the crown jewel of documentary. But then on the personal side, I really was wanting to be a part of something bigger and wanting to create a pipeline of young and up-and-coming documentary producers and underrepresented documentary producers. So it just really felt like the perfect opportunity.
With that being said, what have been your priorities since you have been serving as the executive producer at American Experience?
Yeah, as I said, my priorities have been creating a pipeline for up-and-coming documentary producers, or just documentary producers who maybe hadn't worked with PBS before, but had a really interesting, diverse perspective to American history. I've felt like it was really important to try to make history documentaries more accessible, feeling a little bit more resonant, a little bit more relevant. I really thought that it was an opportunity to make people maybe who weren't history nerds, maybe people who don't love history in the way that I do and that you might, still want to come into the tent with us and really understand how all of these stories that we're doing, even if you're not interested in history per se, will help you understand the present, will help you understand the world that we live in. So those were some of the priorities, like I said, to make it more accessible, more tangible. I wanted to experiment with ways of incorporating pop culture in a way that was still academic and deeply researched and all of those things. I wanted to freshen it up a little bit.
I like that.
Yeah.
Well, should we take a look at some of the films that are coming to the American Experience in 2025?
Sure. We'll start with what we call our Sizzle reel. That's, as you said, a little taste of what we have coming.
For over 35 years, PBS's longest-running history series has been telling the stories of the people and events that have shaped our nation, providing the critical context to understanding our shared history. And viewers are responding. On broadcast, on our digital and social platforms, and in person at station events across the country. And coming soon, new documentaries highlighting the power of protest, innovation, science, and the uniquely American effort to build a more perfect union. First,
What do we want? ADA! What do we want it now?
the long fight for disability rights in America.
We still can't use the telephone.
Accommodations that are commonplace today took decades to realize.
We are American citizens, and we will be part of the American dream.
In a struggle that landed on the very steps of the U.S. Congress. And then,
Let's begin the march for freedom now.
the rise of the most powerful and outspoken civil rights organization ever created.
The NAACP is the story of a nation that is perpetually trying to become a better thing, and the people who are trying to define what that better thing might be.
And its longest-serving leader, who masterminded a legal and political strategy that would change the country forever.
When the NAACP started to win, people had an inkling of hope.
Leveraging African-American voting power in ways never seen before.
We talk a lot about democracy today. Democracy's on the ballot, democracy's over here. No, democracy is something you do. The NAACP was the group that said, no, this is ours. We shed our blood for this country. This is ours.
Next, the race to identify the enemies of clean air.
Exhaust from motor vehicles has been blamed for air pollution problems in metropolitan areas.
As communities across the country were gasping for breath, scientists were searching for a solution. And
Polaroid announces an economy model of the famous color pack camera for half the price of the original.
this was the innovation that made instant photos a snap.
Begin to use a Polaroid land camera, and a crowd gathers.
It was the camera that revolutionized what we documented and how we saw ourselves. And then,
Dr. Kissinger is perhaps one of the major scholars in America and the world today, and he will bring to this responsibility a fresh approach.
a 4-hour series on the complicated figure whose influence spanned decades.
One of the central facts of our period is, for the first time in history, foreign policy has become truly global and therefore truly complicated.
As famous for his lifestyle as he was for his doctrines.
I feel we are at a watershed. And if we act wisely, I think we can look back to all this turmoil as the birth pangs of a more creative and better system.
Yet his primary focus was always American power.
Well, I am definitely looking forward to 2025.
As are we.
In the opening video, we saw clips from documentaries on topics that are ranging from the NAACP to the fight for rights for the disabled community to the life and the legacy of Henry Kissinger. How does American Experience decide what stories to tell?
Yeah, I love that question because it is my absolute favorite part of the job. There is no formula or algorithm for how we decide what films to do. We really are always reading, are always talking to people, are always watching the news, reading the newspaper, and really the inspiration for stories come from everywhere. And so sometimes it's a new book comes out on someone like a Henry Kissinger, and in that book there's just a new perspective or a new way to look at a person, and you think, oh, I would love to do a film on that. Sometimes it is, last summer we had a film on the experience of integrating Boston's public schools, and in doing that, we had the opportunity to present at the NAACP National Convention, which was in Boston. And we just started thinking about the organization and thought it would be a really interesting time to look at the organization and how it's evolved and the growth of it. Sometimes there are characters who pop up in past films who, for one reason or another, really strike a chord with the audience. In the case of our NAACP film, Walter White, who was the longest reigning president of the NAACP, but largely erased from the history books. He has featured in probably 3 to 5 American Experience films in different ways. Voice of Freedom with Marian Anderson. He's the one who lobbied First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to help create this iconic concert at the Lincoln Memorial. And we're like, Walter White is incredible. Why don't we know more? Then he pops up in The Blinding of Isaac Woodard, another film that we had. And through his intervention, basically we have an integrated military and federal workforce. So again, it's like Walter White, like why isn't his name as known? And so I'm just saying it's random, right? It comes from anywhere, but it's just, I think at the core of it is that my team, the filmmakers who work with us, we're all incredibly curious people. And so literally anything can strike a spark. And if we feel like there's a lesson to be learned and something that we can apply to the greater story of our country, and there's enough archival material and enough research material, we're like, let's give it a try.
Well, here's definitely a clip from one of those powerful and illuminating stories that can definitely tell us a lot about our country. And that is the film Nazi Town, USA. Let's take a look.
In ever-increasing numbers, the nation's youth has been going away to camp. This year has seen more boys and girls at camp than ever before. All of them have enjoyed common experiences, common adventures, building muscle, learning fellowship, acquiring camp spirit.
It looked like any summer camp in America. It looked normal, but it wasn't normal. It was Nazi camp. In the 1930s, there were these camps all across the country.
They were indoctrinating centers. that's what they were for, as well as for protecting the purity and the health of your superior breed.
The camps were the creation of something called the German American Bund. The Bund's vision was an America ruled by white Christians. And they thought that Nazism was entirely consistent with American ideals.
My fellow Americans, what would George Washington think and do were he alive today? Would he not plead with his thinking, the loyal and law-abiding people, the true Christian Americans?
The German American Bund is after power. They're after influence within the very fabric of the United States. They want their ideas to become mainstream, and they want people to embrace those ideas.
They were against democracy and thought that America would be a kind of star in a constellation of pro-Nazi governments around the world.
We assume that democracy is something that all Americans embrace. But in the 1930s, there were people in the United States who were ready to try something different.
So the clip begins with showing a footage of what appears to be a summer camp. Specifically, the type of summer camp most parents like myself would love to send their children to. And for some, it evokes memories of a simpler time in American history. It then goes to reveal the context and the backstory to these camps and tells a story many people, including myself, were completely unaware of. In fact, I know that there are many teachers like myself who follow the traditional story that highlights how Americans came together to support the war during World War II. To what extent does Nazi-town USA challenge that traditional narrative of American World War II history?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, first of all, I should just say that I also was not familiar with this before we started making this film. And again, that to me is the beauty of this job, that there are just so many stories that we don't know, right? We've been through school, you're an expert on American history, and there are still so many stories to be told. So for this film, with Nazi-town USA, I thought it would be really important and interesting for us to do this topic, because I think that a lot of times certainly the way that I was taught American history and the lead up to World War II is that America was always unified against Nazism, that because we are a moral and just country, we knew it was wrong right away.
Yeah.
But I think with this film, what we see is that there was a period in the 30s when actually America embraced these ideas of isolationism and not being open to, the quote-unquote other. And I think it's a cautionary tale in a lot of ways for us, where it just showed that sometimes you don't know until you know. And I think that was the case in this film, where the groups like the German American Bund, who espoused this Nazi-adjacent ideology, they were welcomed throughout the country. And in that clip, there was that U.S. map, and you see all of the places where those Nazi indoctrination camps were for little children. And it's shocking. I grew up in Queens, New York. There were camps in Long Island, in New Jersey. There were camps in California. There were camps in the middle of the country. And it just shows you how easy it is to be seduced by ideas sometimes. And I think that the theme of our discussion is how to teach hard history, and I think that this is one of those perfect moments to illustrate that, because we don't like to, we're proud to be American, we are proud to be citizens of this country, but that doesn't mean that you can't acknowledge some of the things that happened that were less admirable. And I think that if you don't acknowledge those things and you don't actually recognize that there were these camps across the country, that there was a rally in Madison Square Garden, right in the center of liberal and progressive New York City, where there were giant portraits of George Washington and the founding fathers, and there were also swastikas. Like, if you don't acknowledge that, it's very easy to fall back into those traps. And I think that for us, when I'm thinking about which films to commission and where to channel our resources, a lot of times it really is that, we're looking at ourselves as a resource, obviously, for teachers and for viewers, but it's also, we are that resource because history provides us with sometimes a blueprint and sometimes a cautionary tale. And I think that when we don't recognize that and we don't study these different chapters of history, we are doomed to repeat them.
Yeah, I completely agree. One of the things that really resonated with me as I was watching this is that I really feel in this country, we like to fall back on this idea that, oh, no, that could never happen in the United States. No, it would never happen. And I feel like a film like this is very powerful because it shows that not only, did it happen on some level, but we can't also just limit it to one part of the country where it did happen. It was all over the country, as we saw for the map. That's definitely something that I like to relate to my students. Don't ever think that something can't happen or we're immune to a movement like this happening. I also, wanted to say that one of the things I love about the resources that PBS LearningMedia has developed for this particular documentary is that we have carefully scaffolded questions that are provided for the students to really help to guide them, to really wrestling with that idea. I love what you said about a blueprint or a cautionary tale. Mm-hmm. So now we're going to show a clip about a story that took place right here in Boston, the busing battleground.
It's clear whites who do not want blacks in their schools are acting in just the same way as violent whites in the South.
I'm not uncomplicit in this. If you saw it on the television, I was there. There was a sense that we were going to lose our community. I had no interest in throwing bricks or a rock, and most people didn't. We weren't raised that way, but it happened. People throwing bricks and rocks.
I was 8 years old, but I needed to feel or pretend that I was part of this thing. Throwing a rock was part of being of the mob, of the us.
When we got to the staging area, waiting for the buses to come back, we saw that the buses had broken windows. It was painful because the kids were coming out crying. Some parents showed up. Some of the kids didn't have their parents to support them.
When I reported to Kevin White on opening day that no black child had been killed, we thought that was a victory. It was the saddest day in Boston's history. But if a black child had been killed, there would have been a civil war.
That night, black leaders were enraged because the public safety of their kids was in jeopardy. They called a meeting to which they invited Mayor White to make it quite clear to him, we expect you to make sure that our kids are safe. We are not going to accept anything but that, and you are not doing that.
It was a very tough night for Kevin White to face angry, frightened black parents because he had promised them that their children would be safe, and they weren't. We had to admit that he had failed, and he asked for their forgiveness. But he wasn't able to deliver on the first and most important obligation that any leader has, which is to keep his community safe.
Black leaders had to make a tough decision to ask black parents to stay the course. Tough decision. All along the way, black parents have had to make very difficult decisions in order to assert their rights and to use their kids in the process.
There are so many desegregation stories that are just waiting to be told. As a matter of fact, when I teach this topic, I use the accompanying PBS LearningMedia resource, which includes a timeline of desegregation campaigns that took place all across the country. Why did American Experience select the desegregation of Boston schools?
I think the reason it was so important for us to do this particular story when, as you said, there were many, many, many stories that we could have chosen to illustrate this topic was that I think that there is this fallacy in the way that we process American history and in the way that we remember our American history, that it was only traumatic in the South, that it was only violent in the South, that it was only contentious in the South and the North, and I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised, but that in the North, in places like New York and Philly and Boston, that it was smooth sailing because all of the extremists were in the South. And I think that when you see this story, when you talk to people, as we did, who grew up in Boston, who were part of this process of integration, it hits you in the gut that it was as problematic in the North as it was everywhere else. But what's also incredible to me about this story is that the scenes that we just saw, and that was some of the worst of it, that was 1970. So it wasn't even the 50s and 60s. And I think that's the other thing, that in the way that we think about American history, we think that everything was resolved by 65, right? 68. And then it was smooth sailing after that. And so seeing this story and knowing how late it was and how, quite frankly, how recent that was, it just gives you a different perspective on that particular topic. It gives you a different perspective on how we deal with really painful issues. And it just makes you think, how far have we come? How much further do we have to go? And I just want to say, watching that clip, I felt so emotional because the people who were featured in that clip, both black and white, they were so generous in giving us their time and being willing to be interviewed and sharing these really challenging and difficult memories. But I think it's important for me to acknowledge that for me, for my team, for all of the filmmakers that we work with, for all of our colleagues throughout public media and GBH, and certainly on the education side, we're not doing these stories to stir up trouble or to be rabble-rousers or to criticize our country and, to be unpatriotic or, any of these things. It's really, for us, it truly is, you can look at challenging things without feeling like we are just painting everyone with this, with this negative brush. And I just think that a lot of the conversations that we have in the country, sometimes there's this feeling, and I mean, you could probably speak to this more than I can, specifically with building curriculums in African American history and AP courses we know, which have been such a flashpoint. It's okay to talk about the tough things, and it doesn't mean that you're down on the country. You can be as proud of the country as you were the day before you saw the film and still feel that way, but just want to talk about it. And I think that's what makes us stronger as a country. I think it's what makes us stronger as citizens. And I think it makes our children stronger and makes them just more critical thinkers. And I think that's the part that sometimes gets lost, because our team, sometimes people are like, oh no, why would you do this hard history? Why would you do this negative topic? Let's only focus on the positive things. And it's we do lots of positive things. And what's positive about even this story is that, to me, the fact that people were willing to come together to talk about it, and the kinds of conversations that we had after the film aired here in Boston, but also across the country, that's positive. That's progress. The fact that we are willing to recognize that things were not smooth, but we can make it better, and perhaps we haven't gone far enough. I think all of those things are an important part of the conversation. And so, we don't want to live with our heads in the clouds all the time and just pretend that everything's fine. But we also don't want to run around screaming the sky is falling. But there's a way that you can be realistic and also just acknowledge truth when there is truth to acknowledge. And I think that that's where we're coming from.
Yeah, good point. Going along with having our students become critical, like learners and thinkers, the interactive that accompanies this particular documentary. One of the things I love when I use it in my classroom, it begins by having students evaluate or analyze a series of images, still shots that are taken from the video. And we don't tell the students where it's coming from, where this desegregation campaign took place. And students have to rely on what they've learned about this era, what they think they know, and what they assume about it to try to figure out what's going on and where is it taking place. And then after we have the students analyze these different, still shots and they talk about it, then we show a clip similar to what we all saw, and the students are shocked that it took place in Boston. One of the things I love about that shock value, though, is it allows the students to be open to want to know more, and then to also question the traditional narrative that they've been told about this time period. But I want to go back.
That makes me happy. I just have to say, I appreciate that, and I love hearing that, and it makes us feel so proud of the work that we're doing, knowing that teachers like you can use it in that way, because truly that is the goal. Like, we're doing it for educational purposes, and we're doing it to start conversations, and as we've both acknowledged, like, to develop these critical thinking skills and to challenge our assumptions. So I love that you use it. Thank you for that. I should have said that at the beginning.
Well, thank
we really
for making
appreciate
these. It definitely enhances what we're learning in class, but I actually would like to put forth the question that many of my students, maybe not a question that they have, but definitely an issue that does come up. And that's, regarding seeing these images and watching the documentary. They're shocked that it took place, in the 1970s, and that so many of these individuals are still living today. As a matter of fact, many would argue that one of the reasons why many school districts around the country are actually staying away from telling this hard history and having students explore these stories and these events from the civil rights movement, simply because a lot of the footage contains extremely clear images of individuals, interviews, and actions of people who opposed integration, and people that supported it and can be identified today. I was truly fascinated by the fact that in this particular documentary, it contained very candid interviews with people that were on both sides. And I would just love to know, and one of the questions my students have asked is, how does American Experience make the decision to tell these sensitive stories where many of the people that are impacted by these events are still alive today?
I think it's important to, when you have the opportunity to have a living witness talk about their experience and explain why they were on one side or the other, also perhaps to explain why they've changed their thinking. Like, I think that is an invaluable resource, because I think that one of the things that can be hard for people who are not fans of history or who just are less comfortable with it, it feels like, oh, it's just so long ago, everyone's dead, it's hundreds of years ago, like, that person can't relate to me, they don't live in my world. And so when you do a story like this, and you have someone who lived through it, who maybe was even in the footage and can look back at what they did, I just think that that's like an extra layer of power, and it just feels more real, and I think it just feels more relatable, not just to students, but even to adults.
Yes.
And in the clip that we just saw, we had two white Bostonians who talked about their role or how they felt when they were on the side of the argument that opposed integration. And we had incredible live events and conversations, including with two of the people who we saw in that clip. And I think even for them, it was so emotional and in some ways cathartic to acknowledge, like, that's who I was then, that's not who I am now. But also, I think that one of the things that if I can say so myself, that we did beautifully in that film was humanize them, and not just say, like, oh, this person's evil, this person was angelic, right? And that because they did this thing, that they were, the worst of the worst or immoral or whatever. I think that in the film we gave people across the spectrum the opportunity to explain how they felt. And I think that one of the specific things that really struck me in that particular film is that the white community in Boston was also getting a raw deal in that particular instance. And I don't think that, like, obviously I have one perspective on school integration and equal rights, obviously, as a Black woman, but I think that even I, like, had never really thought about that story from their point of view. And they were, you know, some of them were just, you know, just felt very strongly that they didn't want integration. Of course, I'm not saying that they didn't. But there were other people who were like, I don't understand why I have to leave my neighborhood, and I don't understand why I'm a lower class or working class white person and my school is underfunded and decrepit, and I'm being sent across town an hour away to another decrepit, underfunded school. And I feel like even that, like, that's a part of the conversation that was never present, like, had never surfaced. And so I just feel like when you do have those opportunities to talk to living witnesses, to talk to people who were there, it may change your perspective, but as I said, like, it makes it feel more real, because you can ask a person questions and have a genuine conversation in a way that you can't when you're just reading someone's writings from, you know, 200 years ago. Like, both are valuable, but I do think that there's something extra special, particularly for young people, when you get to look at a person who experiences the world as you do, but went through these monumental changes and movements and lived through them.
Well, for our last clip, we're going to take a look at another very complex story that just premiered, and it tells the story of a forgotten and tragic event that took place in U.S. history, American coup, Wilmington, 1898.
Firing began, and it seemed like a mighty battle in wartime. The shrieks and screams of children, of mothers, of wives were heard, such as caused the blood of the most inhuman person to creep. Reverend J. Allen Kirk.
Families are grabbing whatever they can and getting out of their houses, and they're running because they're assuming their houses are going to be torched, they're all going to be killed, and 2,000 people start going through the streets, stepping over or around these bodies. Many of them go to Pine Forest Cemetery, which is the black cemetery, on the assumption that maybe the white gunmen wouldn't go there. They go into the swamps and into the forests, any place they can hide from the white gunmen. A sunny, mild day had suddenly turned into a gray, rainy, cold day. They didn't have enough time to bring blankets or heavy coats because early in the day it had been mild, so they're completely exposed to the elements. In a driving cold November rain, huddled.
Elise Sagewar, who was one of the Sagewar sisters, she remembers being young and held in the rushes of the Cape Fear River, hiding out that night, that November 10th.
And her father had to hold her mouth down from screaming as dead bodies passed them through the water.
So think about that. You're running for safety into a swamp because it's safer in a swamp than it is in your home.
By mid-afternoon on November 10th, the shooting had started to die down because so many people had fled. Waddell and the other leaders of the conspiracy turned to actually taking over the city government. They met at Thalian Hall, and all these gunmen from the streets course in there in just a high state of rage and anticipation. They call the sitting government in, the mayor, the police chief, the aldermen, and at gunpoint, they tell them that there is a white revolution, their jobs no longer exist, and they have to resign. Then the mob leaders installed Waddell as mayor. They replaced the police chief with a former Confederate officer.
Following the rule of law that said if a member of the Board of Aldermen resigns his seat, the existing board then votes to fill the vacancy. Waddell conveniently had a list of pre-approved white supremacy candidates for the Board of Aldermen seats for each precinct. And one by one, members of the Board of Aldermen resigned their seats, and one by one, new people were put in place.
Alderman Keith and C.D. Morrill, having tendered their resignations as member of the board from the 3rd Ward, Hugh McCrae and J. Allen Taylor were elected aldermen in their stead. They were sworn in by the mayor and took their seats.
This is a transition of government under duress. A definition of a coup d'etat is an armed overthrow of a legally elected government, which is what happened on this day in Wilmington.
Before I get started, I just wanted to, as a side note, thank you for interviewing Carol Anderson. She is, just an amazing historian. I could listen to her talk about history all day. And I love that Amex documentaries, they do such a great job of bringing in just experts and historians that can really kind of, put us in a place to understand a lot of times complex stories.
Yeah, we are definitely a fan of Carol Anderson's, but truly all of the historians who work with us, we choose people who are not just incredible academics, but also incredible storytellers,
yes,
right?
And
like
she is, yes.
They have a way of putting it. She's appeared in a couple of other films of ours as well, but they're superstars.
So the coup in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 and the massacre and displacement of the town's black population has been largely forgotten and was not even mentioned in North Carolina's textbooks until relatively recently. Why and how has this event in our nation's history been erased?
Oof, why has it been erased? I will answer using someone else's answer. In the film, one of the descendants who appears in our film, he is the descendant of Josephus Daniels, who was the publisher and owner of the Raleigh News and Observer. At the time, it was the daily newspaper that was used to share a lot of anti-black propaganda, a lot of white supremacist propaganda. Josephus Daniels' great nephew, I believe it was, or grandson, who appears in our film, says, "We always bury the things we are ashamed of." And so, like, I still get goosebumps just thinking about him saying that, because I think that on one hand, that is so true, and it's like we've been talking about that. Sometimes like these topics are hard. Yeah. They are not flattering, and sometimes we want to see ourselves in the very best light, and so we don't want to acknowledge some of the things that we've done or that we've seen or that we've participated in that are less than stellar. But I think it's also, the proverb, right? History gets written by the winner. Like I'm badly paraphrasing and butchering it, but you guys, know what I'm talking about. I think that that's also at play here. This is a story where, in the bluntest terms, the bad guys won. And so they didn't see themselves as bad guys. And so they wanted to promote their version of the story, right? They're the victors. So they're just like, this is what happened. And so they used textbooks decade after decade to spin the story in a way that put them in the best light, right? They wanted to continue with the fallacy, the painful fallacy that Black government and multiracial government at that time, post-Reconstruction, was automatically bad government, that the only way to have good government was to have white people governing. And so it served their interests to tell the story in that way. And I just have to say, the community of Wilmington is extraordinary in the way that they've been trying to grapple with this painful history, the way that they have been working to correct the official record. One of the things that I'm so proud of with this film is, in conjunction with PBS North Carolina, they're using the film and all of the resources that were gathered with the film to design a curriculum for teachers in North Carolina.
Yeah.
We have PhD historians who appear in the film, in addition to Carol Anderson, but some who were native North Carolinians who went through their entire education in North Carolina, who were like, I am Dr. So-and-so, and I've never heard this, right? And so it's mind-boggling when you think about how far people, institutions, structurally can go to bury history. And I think that at my core, what I hope that we can do with the series is just uncover that hidden history and give people the opportunity to not feel gaslit by history, right? And to acknowledge that these things happened. It's awful. We're sad that it happened, but if we want to move forward, we have to address it. We have to acknowledge it. We have to take these lessons from it. And so I just think, like, why was it buried? Because it's unpleasant. But that's not enough of a reason, right?
Yeah.
Lots of things are unpleasant. Face it head on and move on.
Yeah, and as difficult and as unpleasant the story is, one of the things I do have to say is that I do find this resource particularly helpful for my students because you included so many different ways to tell it, whether it was with cartoon imagery or footage of present-day locations, or interviews with the descendants, or bringing in historians, or with primary source photographs. It was definitely a way that my students could digest it, understand it, and kind of like wrestle with it. So my question is, why did you choose these many different strategies when telling this story?
For this particular film, the filmmakers and their editor, like that whole team, they came to the project wanting to experiment with visuals. You know, I think one of the things that's so hard about what we do with historical filmmaking is that sometimes archival is hard to come by, and sometimes there's just not that much footage, right? It's not like today where everyone's recording everything you have your phone, like everyone's a filmmaker. You know, this is a story that takes place in the 1890s, and and earlier, and so there's a limited amount of material. And I think that we just felt this story was so important for people to digest, as you said, and we just really wanted it to feel accessible. We wanted people to stay with it because it is a challenging story. It is a challenging history. We just really thought the more that we can do to make it come alive and to draw you in, that we should, because I think that you could easily have made this film with only black and white photographs, but I think it would be hard, right? Like, I think it would be a harder watch versus what we tried to do with this, and just really make it come alive so that the emotions and the feelings, the fear, the excitement, the pride, like just the different things that were happening through this story really come through in different ways, and it's easier to latch onto, I think, right? And we're so used to, we live in this world where media is so fast and colorful and bright. That's another challenge that we think about with American Experience. Like, we're competing with everything. We're competing with Netflix, with YouTube, with ABC, with Disney, with everyone. And so it's like, we have to step up our game, right, to make sure that what's appealing to someone who watches those things on various streamers and channels will also find our work appealing.
When I was a senior in the 90s, we were very fortunate because we had one of the lawyers that was on the team for the plaintiffs during the Rosewood case in the 90s. And for people in the crowd that may not be familiar with the Rosewood Massacre, I'm originally from Florida. Rosewood was a town that was right outside of Gainesville. It was an all-black town, and they were pretty economically prosperous in 1923. And definitely it gained the attention of Gainesville, which was right next to it, an all-white community. And a white woman she had said that she had been raped, and that was, kind of like the excuse that they needed to go in, and they pretty much destroyed the town. It's no longer there. And I remember the lawyer that helped to argue the case on their behalf and won. I remember him coming to my school, and that was the first time I'd ever heard it before. This was before John Singleton did the film. And I just remember him telling me, about the children and a lot of the women that had to run into the swamp, just like what we saw here, and had to hide out. And they were cold, and they were separated, and some children never were reunited with their parents because some of their parents were killed. And I just remember hearing that story, and it really stuck with me. But I remember struggling to try to imagine what that experience could possibly be like. And as I was watching the film the first time I saw Wilmington coup, I just thought my students are going to be fortunate because they're not going to have to struggle to imagine it like I had to. I think you all did such an amazing job with just so many of the different ways that you presented the story to really make our students understand that many of these family members are still alive today, and the impact of what happened to this town. A lot of people just still haven't recovered. So I think this is a great time to perhaps open up the floor to any questions that people may have. Yeah. The microphone is up here if anyone is interested. Yeah. Well, while we wait, I have a couple more, if that's
Go
okay.
for it. I was like, we can keep talking.
Well, I have one question. How do you think American Experience, how do you all hope their films are going to impact student understandings or interpretation of history in the year to come, in 2025?
For 2025 specifically, I think how do I want students to think about our films? We saw in the beginning we had clips from our film on the NAACP.
Can't wait for that one.
Fantastic already. We had clips from the Capitol Crawl, which is about the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which again wasn't passed until 1990. So again, so recent, such recent history. We have a fun film on the Polaroid camera, which is like the precursor to our personal photography craze. So I think one of the themes that I think is present and will be strong in the 2025 season is people power, citizen activism, particularly with the NAACP and Americans with Disabilities Act story. You see regular people who see a problem and decide that they want to be a part of solving the problem, right? That they don't want to sit back and wait for the government, someone else to swoop in and take care of it. They feel that they have agency and that they want to be, as citizens, they want to be a part of the solution. And so I love that theme. I love that idea. I think that has actually unintentionally or intentionally been a theme throughout since I've been at American Experience in these last 4 years. This idea that we are not powerless as individuals, that we can do something. If you see something, say something. Like if there's a problem that you want to tackle, like there's a way for you to get involved. And so whether that's joining a local branch of an organization, whether that's you showing up for a protest, whether that's you writing to your representative in Congress, whether it's you showing up to vote, showing up at the polls, there are all these different avenues for each of us to be a part of improving the country that we live in. And so I think that is a really important lesson and reminder for students that you have the power, right? You can do something about whatever it is that you feel strongly about. Climate change, educational curriculum, representation in government, student loan debt forgiveness, whatever it is, whatever it is that motivates you, you can become involved. And I think that that's just a critical lesson for students and for young people.
So my last and final question. Oh, we got a question? All right.
Hi, my name's Sandy Pope. I'm a teacher educator in Salisbury, Maryland. And kind of to that point, and earlier you were talking about people get their information from TikTok. Have you all thought about getting some kind of information out for how students can be more involved in creating their own films, their own documentaries as one avenue for their engagement, kind of carrying forward some of the excellent stuff that you all are doing, but letting them bring it to a really hyper-local element for themselves?
I love that question. It's a great question. We don't necessarily have something in development right now where where students are involved in the making of films, but I think a lot of our resources, perhaps with PBS LearningMedia, with GBH Education, like I think they're more on the front lines of doing that. But I just think that, to your point, it is important to meet students where they are, and so we do think about it, and we are thinking about, how do we engage on the different platforms. And so I love the idea of again, giving students the power to tell some of these stories and to interpret primary resources and talk about it at a hyperlocal level. So we don't necessarily do that with the series, but I think that our educational partners definitely think about that in a lot more of a hands-on, constructive way. But it's a great goal. Thank you.
And I think my final question, even though I think you kind of answered it a little bit, was for people like myself, teachers, and the many teachers that are in the room right now, how does American Experience hope their films will impact or influence our instruction in class and our discussions about history with our students?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we hope that we can continue to provide resources for you to help you tell some of the stories that are so important to understanding our country in a visual way, in a lively way, in a way that brings things to life. That's what we want to do. Our partners at PBS LearningMedia and on the education team, they really take that to heart. And we're making the films for an adult audience, for a younger audience, just for a mainstream audience. But what they do that's so important is they look at our films through the lens of educators and how can, what of the films can we take and really, repurpose it in a way through the U.S. History Collection, through the Civics Collection. How can we take these incredible films and make them into even more incredible resources? So I think for us, it's just wanting to make more films that align with your curriculums and that help you teach the students who are our future legislators and presidents and teachers and, everything. Like, we depend on that next generation. So whatever we can do to help foster an understanding of our country, like, that's when we feel like we've won.
Good people, the fabulous Cameo George, executive producer of Amex.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alysha.
Thank you.
Thanks for doing it.
Awesome.